At Christmas dinner, my brother said, "Time to move out," so I showed him the property deed. It was snowing that night in Chicago, the kind of heavy, silent snow that makes the world outside feel distant and forgiving. Inside the McAdams family estate, however, forgiveness was in short supply. The dining room glowed with soft candlelight, the kind my mother insisted on using for presentation, even though she couldn't remember the last time she'd cooked anything herself. The table was set for 8, but the tension made it feel crowded. Silver cutlery, crystal glasses, cloth napkins folded into swans. Everything appeared perfect if you didn't know us. I had returned home 2 years ago, not because I was broke, and not because I needed saving, but because the people who tried to erase me never thought to check who really held the pen. Tonight, they were about to learn. My name is Rachel McAdams. I'm 35 years old, and I used to design product roadmaps for one of the top wearable tech firms in San Francisco. That is, until a colleague I mentored walked into a boardroom and presented my work as her own. I confronted her. She cried. HR scheduled a meeting. By the time it was over, I was told I'd become a disruption to team cohesion. 2 weeks later, I boxed up 7 years of strategy, innovation, and long nights, then flew back to Chicago and moved into the McAdams family home alone. The irony wasn't lost on me. My brother Daniel had always said I'd be the one to flame out. I just never expected it to happen this publicly. But losing my job wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was watching my parents quietly agree with the decision, offering me a guest room in the back wing like I was an embarrassed cousin visiting from out of state. Daniel, of course, had inherited the family business after my father stepped down. McAdams Holdings was once a respected name in Midwestern property development. But under Daniel, it had become something else entirely. I saw the signs: early empty investments, inflated valuations, ridiculous tax shelters, but I wasn't in the room where decisions were made. I was the little sister who chose gadgets over legacy. As my mother liked to say, still, I stayed. I watched, and I waited. Now, 2 years later, I sat at the far end of the table, across from Daniel and his wife Julia, who wore a smile so polished it could cut glass. My father sat silent at the head, nursing his 3rd glass of scotch, while my mother pretended not to notice. The roasted goose sat untouched. Nora, the housekeeper, had just refilled my water when Daniel cleared his throat. "Rachel," he said casually, as if he were asking me to pass the salt. "You've been here a while. I think it's time we all agreed that this setup has run its course." He didn't look at me when he spoke. He never did. He looked at Julia, who gave him a slight nod. "We've had an offer, a strong one. Developers want the land. They're ready to move quickly. And frankly, it's not fair to keep holding on to this place just for nostalgia. You'll need to move out by the new year." I glanced around the table. My mother was dabbing the corners of her mouth with a linen napkin, pretending to be surprised. My father shifted slightly but said nothing. Julia sipped her wine like someone who thought she'd finally won. I counted to 3, picked up my glass, and drank slowly, letting the room simmer. "That's interesting," I said, setting my glass down with care. "Tell me more about these developers." Daniel smirked. "Big firm out of New York, clean records, strong cash, pre-approved funding. You wouldn't understand the details, but it's a smart deal." I smiled. "Just enough. Actually, I do understand. That's why I had my legal team vet them 2 months ago. When they first reached out, Daniel blinked. Your legal team, from beside my chair. I reached down and retrieved a slim leather folder. I opened it slowly, deliberately. Yes, I said, sliding a set of documents onto the linen. They had concerns about conflict of interest and prior litigation involving construction fraud. Naturally, I paid attention because as the legal owner of this property, I had a lot to lose. Silence hit the table like a dropped knife. That's not possible, Daniel said. The house is part of the family trust. I looked at him for the first time all evening. It was. Until the trust defaulted on its debt 18 months ago, and the bank liquidated part of its assets, including this property. A private holding firm acquired it with a cash offer. I paused. That holding firm is mine. My mother paled. My father finally looked up. Julia's lips parted, but no sound came out. Daniel stood. You're lying. I didn't flinch. Would you like to see the deed? I held up the folder and slowly turned the first page. I've let you all live here rent-free for 2 years. I figured that was fair. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. But if you're giving me a week's notice to vacate, Daniel, then allow me to return the favor. You all have 24 hours. The folder was still on the table when Daniel walked out, his face dark with confusion and rage. My father stood silently and followed him, mumbling something under his breath, probably trying to calculate what he had missed. My mother, still seated, stared at the folder like it had burned a hole through the linen. Only Julia stayed frozen in place, her wine glass gripped tight in her hand. I watched her closely. She had once been my friend before she married into power, before she learned that being silent earned her more comfort than speaking up. I waited until her hand trembled. Then I leaned back in my chair and smiled the way she used to when I was the one being humiliated. That night, I didn't sleep. I walked the halls of the estate alone, not out of nostalgia but necessity. I checked locks, collected documents from the study, and filed everything in order. The next morning, I had the security system reset, the guest access codes changed, and Nora informed of the new arrangement. I told her she could stay as long as she wanted. She didn't ask questions, just nodded and said she would pack up Daniel's things with gloves on. Nora had worked in this house for over 25 years, long enough to know when the tides turned. When I offered her a permanent contract and triple her current pay, she didn't flinch. She only asked one thing. Will it finally be quiet now? I said I couldn't promise quiet, but I could promise truth. 3 years earlier, none of this had been in sight. Back then, I was too trusting, too willing to believe that if I worked hard enough, stayed late enough, and held my tongue often enough, people would see me. I was wrong. My mistake wasn't in trusting the wrong person at work. My mistake was thinking my family would be on my side when the fall came, when I was pushed out of my job. I came home with bruises on my confidence, still holding on to a thread of hope that someone would ask what had happened, maybe even offer support, but instead of concern. I got Claire's silence, Ethan's disappointment, and Daniel's smirk. He even joked once that maybe this tech thing wasn't for girls after all. Julia laughed. That was the day something inside me began to shift. While they were busy mocking my career path, I was watching the numbers. The family business had been showing signs of rot for years. I knew how to read a quarterly report, how to spot over-leveraged developments and shell companies with no real assets. But when I asked about certain payments and inconsistencies in my father's old financial records, I was shut down. Not your lane, Daniel had said. So I started drawing a new lane. I reached out to an old law professor who once told me I'd make a better forensic analyst than a product manager. I hired him quietly. Through a third-party consultancy, I asked him to look into McAdams Holdings and every transaction linked to it in the past decade. I told no one, not even Nora. The deeper we looked, the worse it got. Loans taken in the company's name to buy personal property, missing pension contributions, a joint account in the Cayman Islands shared between Daniel and Julia. Even Claire, who once prided herself on class, had signed off on inflated charity partnerships that funneled funds back into Ethan's private real estate projects. I didn't say a word. I waited. And in that time, I began to rebuild myself quietly. I consulted for a startup under a pseudonym. I invested in 2 early-stage tech incubators. I bought the family estate the moment it hit the distressed assets list, using a holding company set up by my professor's firm. Everything I did had one purpose, not revenge, but readiness. By the time the Christmas dinner arrived, I wasn't angry anymore. I had moved past needing them to understand. I just needed them to stop pretending they were untouchable. But even then, I didn't expect what would happen next. Daniel came back the following afternoon, not to apologize, but to demand I reverse whatever stunt I'd pulled. He threatened legal action, public scandal, even told me he'd call in every favor the family had at City Hall. I told him I welcomed the lawsuit. Discovery can be enlightening, I said. He turned red. Julia stood behind him, arms folded, but said nothing. I gave them one last offer: walk away, take a settlement, and never speak my name again. Daniel laughed in my face. He called me petty. He called me unstable. Then he said something I'll never forget. You'll always be the broken one. The house may be yours on paper, but we both know who really belongs here. I said nothing then, just watched as they left, slamming the front door like it still belonged to them. Later that night, I opened a drawer in Ethan's study and retrieved the original ledger I had found months ago. I ran my fingers over the edges of the pages, each one filled with proof that their empire wasn't built on legacy. It was built on lies. The original ledger I had recovered wasn't stored with other files in the office safe or hidden behind false drawers. It was in plain sight, bound in green leather and wedged between gardening books in the back hallway. That alone told me everything I needed to know about how careless they had become. Inside were notations going back 11 years, handwritten by my father in neat columns. The entries looked harmless at first: consulting fees, miscellaneous reimbursements, property maintenance. But the amounts were wrong, the vendors fake, and the signatures forged. What began as creative accounting had become full-blown embezzlement, and Daniel had followed right in his footsteps. The ledger gave me context, but not closure. I needed more than numbers. I needed links, paper trails, signatories. That's when I called Mr. Langston, the family's longtime estate attorney. I had known him since I was 9. He taught me how to shuffle cards at a holiday party once, told me the trick wasn't in the sleight of hand, but in knowing when the other player blinked. I asked him to meet me at a neutral location. We sat in the back of a quiet coffee shop off Ashland Avenue, where the scent of roasted beans covered any tension in the air. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I placed the ledger on the table and said, "I need to know if you've seen this before." He didn't touch it, just studied it like he was calculating how far off the ground he was standing. Finally, he said, "Where did you find it?" I told him. He nodded once. Then, after a long pause, he admitted what I suspected. He had prepared the paperwork for the trust transfer that put the estate into a vulnerable financial position. It wasn't illegal on the surface, But the details mattered. Ethan had leveraged the estate to cover a real estate project in Arizona that collapsed 3 months later. When the trust defaulted, the house became a distressed asset. He told me it was temporary. Langston said quietly. He promised it was a stopgap. I didn't respond. I opened the folder beside me and slid out 2 letters, signed by Ethan, one authorizing the transfer, the other pre-signing a backdated tax document that nullified the protection clause for family residents. Langston went pale. He used my signature as a witness. His voice broke a little then. I never signed that. In that moment, I realized something I hadn't before. I wasn't the only one they had lied to. I wasn't the only one used and dismissed. I told Langston he had a choice. He could testify when the time came, or he could disappear with a severance I'd already arranged in a blind trust. To my surprise, he looked relieved. "I'll testify," he said. They thought I was too old to notice, but I noticed everything. I nodded. We shook hands, and just like that, another piece moved quietly into place. Back at the estate, I began consolidating. The new ownership was official, but I still needed to make sure every signature tied to the house aligned with my holding firm. I called in an appraiser, had every inch of the property documented, and sent copies of all findings to a compliance team I trusted. I did not want loopholes. I wanted proof while I worked. Daniel tried to smear me in the press. An anonymous tip landed on a local blog claiming I had manipulated our Aunt Vivian into changing her will. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't smart, because what Daniel didn't know was that I had found Aunt Vivian's original will 3 years earlier, hidden in a folder labeled Tax Drafts in our father's basement study. The will named me as primary heir to the estate, citing my dedication to education and innovation. 2 things the rest of the family mocked at every dinner table, but that will had never been filed. Instead, a newer one had surfaced after Vivian's sudden death, naming Daniel and Ethan as joint beneficiaries. The timing was suspicious. The signature was rushed. And the witness, Julia, the same Julia who had once whispered to me over wine that she would sign anything to keep Daniel happy. I remembered the way her hand shook that night, not from guilt, but from fear. I now had the original will, forensic analysis showing discrepancies in the ink age, and a digital log of hospital security footage from the night Aunt Vivian died. I hadn't planned on using all of it, but Daniel kept pushing. He threatened litigation, asset freezes, even hinted at defamation. He left one voicemail that ended with, "You think you've won, but this house, this company, this family, it's ours. You were just passing through." I played that voicemail twice. Then I filed it under Evidence A. The next step was clear. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about the company, about the empire they were still using to prop up their image. And I had a plan for that too, because while Daniel had been building facades, I had been quietly buying votes. 2 years before Daniel tried to evict me from the house, I started buying pieces of the company he thought he owned, not directly. Of course, that would have triggered alarms. I used proxy investors, angel groups I'd worked with during my consulting days, and shell companies formed in Delaware and the Isle of Man. The goal wasn't to cause disruption. It was to earn voting rights, quietly, one transaction at a time. McAdams Holdings was privately held, but a portion of its shares were in circulation through a legacy family partnership agreement that allowed outside investment. My father had once said the clause was a mistake, a leftover from an era when the company needed outside capital. What he didn't know was that it would be the same clause that unraveled him. By the time I returned to Chicago, I controlled just under 18% of the total voting shares. By the time Daniel tried to sell the family estate, that number had risen to 27. What made it more satisfying was that most of my stake had come from distressed trust liquidations funds Daniel himself had forced to close when he leveraged overextended assets to cover his Dubai losses. The shares weren't cheap, but I wasn't trying to be frugal. I was buying leverage, and once I crossed the 30% threshold, I had legal grounds to trigger a special shareholders meeting without executive approval. The week after the Christmas dinner, I did exactly that. I remember the moment the notification hit the inbox of every major partner. The subject line was simple: request for extraordinary general meeting, McAdams Holdings. No accusations, no threats, just an official request, time-stamped, legally sound, and backed by voting weight that couldn't be ignored. Daniel must have seen it within minutes. He called 3 times. I didn't pick up. Instead, I called Angela Ortiz, CEO of a nonprofit tech incubator I had supported years ago. She had once told me that change never comes from the center, it comes from the margins, from the people who were never supposed to lead. I asked her if she would consider serving on a temporary governance review panel. She said yes before I finished the sentence. What followed in the next 10 days was what I can only describe as controlled chaos. Daniel tried to rally the remaining family-aligned investors, using every favor and name drop he could muster. Julia went on local news to do a PR interview about preserving family values in business. My mother hosted a brunch at the country club, trying to smooth things over. It didn't matter. The documents spoke louder. So did the forensic audit I commissioned through a third-party compliance firm, which outlined over 40 instances of financial misconduct, including suspicious licensing fees, inflated development costs, and diverted charitable funds. Each report was labeled, time-stamped, and packaged for legal counsel. During this time, I stayed quiet. I didn't post on social media. I didn't call journalists. I let Daniel spiral in public while I prepared in silence. The only statement I made was a 2-line email confirming that I would attend the special meeting in person. Alongside my appointed proxy, that was enough. The boardroom was packed when I walked in. Men in tailored suits turned slowly toward the door, some whispering, others pretending they didn't notice me. Daniel was already seated at the head of the table. Julia wasn't there. My father sat in the corner, avoiding my gaze. Claire stood by the window, trying to look composed in a gray blazer she hadn't worn since 2015. I sat across from Daniel. I didn't bring a briefcase or a team of lawyers, just one folder and a laptop. The meeting opened formally. Minutes were read, attendance confirmed. Then came the motion of vote on forming an independent audit committee and suspending all executive decision-making authority pending the results of the investigation. I made no speeches. I simply played the voicemail. The one where Daniel threatened me, mocked me, claimed the company was ours, and I was just passing through. The silence afterward was not just awkward, it was strategic. The board members didn't need convincing. They needed cover. And my documentation gave it to them. The vote passed, 6-1. My father abstained. Daniel was removed from all operational control, pending legal review. Julia filed for separation the next day. Claire left the country club board quietly and began withdrawing funds from her personal accounts. As for me, I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I went back to the house, opened a bottle of wine, and emailed my lawyer to initiate the second phase, because while they were still reeling from losing the business, they hadn't yet realized they'd also lost the story. Once Daniel lost operational control, the silence from the family was almost louder than the noise had been. Claire stopped calling altogether, which was ironic considering how many times she used to text me reminders about manners, obligations, and dress codes. Ethan retreated to his lake house, or so I was told, and refused to take calls from the remaining board members. Julia filed for divorce quietly, requesting her maiden name and sole custody of a French bulldog named Milo. Daniel stayed mostly out of sight, except for one terse email to the board claiming the vote had been coerced. He attached no proof. He didn't need to. Everyone already knew it wasn't. While they processed their own downfall, I focused on the documentation. The thing about people who lie professionally is they tend to get sloppy when they think no one's watching. They reuse tactics. They recycle names. They hide paper trails in obvious places, assuming no one will question authority. But I had spent the past 2 years watching, and I knew where to look. The most damning document came not from the ledger or the trust, but from a notarized letter misfiled in a maintenance folder from 3 years ago. It was a transfer confirmation, showing a silent equity trade made between Daniel and a developer who had since gone bankrupt. The signature wasn't Daniel's. It was mine, forged, sloppy. I brought the letter to a handwriting expert who had previously worked with the state attorney's office. Within hours, he confirmed what I already suspected. The signature was fabricated. Worse, it had been used to leverage debt from my own dormant trust account, one I hadn't touched since college. That explained the missing funds I discovered a year prior, the unexplained withdrawals buried in quarterly summaries, disguised as advanced estate planning. It wasn't just manipulation, it was theft, armed with evidence. I met with the family's former financial auditor, a man named Calvin, who had retired early after what the family called creative differences. When I asked him about the discrepancies, he didn't deny them. In fact, he opened a folder he'd been saving for years. I knew this day would come, he said. Inside were backup files, emails between Ethan and Daniel, expense approvals that bypassed board oversight, and digital receipts showing internal accounts being drained and funneled offshore. What Calvin gave me wasn't just proof of negligence. It was a map. From that map, I traced funds back to a charity initiative Daniel had launched in Aunt Vivian's name the year she died. On the surface, it looked generous education grants, youth leadership programs, tech outreach. But the back end showed something else entirely. Funds had been redirected through a dummy foundation in Nevada and then into an LLC registered to a private address in Boston. That LLC belonged to Julia. The charity had never operated. The programs never existed. It was a front. At this point, I had enough to take them all down. But I wasn't rushing. I needed timing. I needed the pressure to come, not just from me, but from within the systems they had exploited. I compiled everything into a single encrypted drive and delivered it to a law firm specializing in financial crimes and corporate fraud. I also made 3 copies, one for the authorities, one for the media, and one for myself. I kept the original in a safety deposit box under Nora's name. She didn't ask why. She just took the key and said, "They always underestimated you. I'm glad you let them." The day before the board was scheduled to meet again, Daniel showed up at the house uninvited. He didn't ring the bell. He used the old security code, the one I had forgotten to deactivate, and walked into the front hall like it still belonged to him. Nora found him in the kitchen, staring at the fireplace where our father's portrait used to hang. I came downstairs without saying a word. He looked thinner, older, defeated in a way he didn't know how to hide. He asked if we could talk. I said 5 minutes. He didn't apologize. He asked for leverage. He said, "What do you want in exchange for keeping this quiet?" I didn't blink. "The truth," I said, "and your signature, a full confession, notarized, signed by you, naming the accounts, the timelines, the beneficiaries." He hesitated. "That would destroy me." I nodded. "It already has." He didn't speak again, just sat down at the marble counter and stared at his hands. I handed him a pen. He took it. Daniel didn't argue when I placed the confession in front of him. He just sat at the kitchen counter, looking at the papers like they belonged to someone else. I poured him a glass of water without being asked, placed it beside the envelope, then stepped back without a word. The marble countertop between us felt colder than usual, or maybe it was just the weight of what hung in the air. It wasn't just the end of a business dispute. It was the unraveling of a carefully curated illusion. And for once, he wasn't holding the cards. He read the pages carefully. Every paragraph named him in some form of misappropriation, financial fraud, or breach of trust. His name appeared next to offshore accounts, shell donations, and the forged signature that pulled from my trust without consent. His expression didn't shift, but I could see it in the way he stopped blinking. When he reached the final page, he looked up and asked, "Will this be made public?" I said yes, calmly, because the truth has no obligation to stay private just to protect someone's comfort. He stared at the signature line for a long moment before picking up the pen. I expected him to write quickly, but he signed slowly, pressing the ink into the paper like he needed it to last. After he finished, he slid the documents toward me without making eye contact. Then he said, not bitterly, but hollowly, "You were always watching." I nodded once. Someone had to. There wasn't satisfaction in that moment, no vindication, just a clean, sharp sense of closure. I placed the signed confession into the envelope, sealed it, then filed it with the rest of the evidence in the drawer I had reinforced with a lock after the Christmas dinner. I didn't offer him a ride. I didn't ask him to stay. He left the house on foot, hands in his coat pockets, shoulders slumped not from shame, but from the unfamiliar weight of consequence. The next morning, I submitted the packet to the SEC with a time-stamped legal affidavit and digital backup. I also forwarded a copy to the McAdams Holdings Board, along with a request to appoint an interim review committee. The email was brief. No rhetoric, just facts. Daniel's signature was on every sheet. The committee formed within 72 hours. The legal department, which had spent years turning a blind eye, began quietly offloading responsibility. I didn't blame them. I had seen enough to know how many people had played along to keep their jobs. The difference now was that silence had a cost, and I was done covering it for them. Meanwhile, I met with the foundation team I had proposed during the audit. For years, Daniel and Julia had used Aunt Vivian's name for a fictitious charity that served no one. I intended to reclaim it. I worked with Angela Ortiz and 3 others to draft the structure for what would become the Vivian Fund, a nonprofit tech and business program for underrepresented youth in the Midwest. It wasn't just a statement. It was restitution, and it would be built using funds recovered from the dissolved shell entities Daniel had once used to pay for first-class flights and designer watches. Not long after, my father showed up at the estate. He didn't ask to come in. He stood just inside the gate and waited. I met him in the driveway. He looked tired, not just in his eyes, but in the way he leaned on the words he hadn't yet said. "Is there any way to undo this?" he asked. And I knew he meant more than the legal fallout. I didn't lie to him. I said no. What's been done isn't reversible. You covered for Daniel. You taught him this. You let it happen while pretending I was the problem. He flinched, but didn't deny it. "I thought you were trying to ruin us," he whispered. I shook my head. I was the only one trying to keep us from falling apart. He didn't argue. He left a manila folder on the hood of his car and walked away. I opened it after he was gone. Inside were handwritten notes from years ago memos, drafts of old letters, and one marked in red ink. "Rachel has a point. Review the books." He had known. At some point, he had seen it too. But he chose loyalty over truth. And truth doesn't wait forever. That night, I lit a fire in the same fireplace where he used to tell stories about legacy and honor. I didn't burn the folder. I kept it, not as a trophy, but as a record, because legacies don't begin with pride. They begin with accountability. And from that point on, the rebuilding would happen on my terms. 3 weeks after Daniel's confession was submitted, the investigation widened. Federal compliance officers began reviewing every contract issued under his name in the past 5 years. I didn't interfere. I sent in what was requested, signed what was needed, and let the evidence speak louder than anything I could have said. Meanwhile, inside the house, something had shifted. It was quieter, not just in sound, but in spirit. The tension that used to sit in the air like static had dissolved. The rooms no longer felt like battlefields. They felt like rooms again. I had Nora change the curtains in the dining room, removing the heavy velvet drapes my mother insisted on, and replacing them with simple linen panels. The sun came through differently after that. I donated the antique portraits to a museum archive. The one of Ethan in his early years was boxed and sent to him with a note. "Take care of your history. I'm writing mine." I didn't expect a reply, and none came. The rest of the house followed the same rhythm. Rooms once filled with posturing and tension were stripped of their excess and cleared for something more practical. It wasn't renovation. It was reclamation. That month, I invited Angela Ortiz to visit the estate. We walked the long hallway where family photographs once hung in chronological pride. I told her I had a new idea. Instead of holding on to the house as a symbol of what was lost, I wanted to transform it, not into another company headquarters, not into a private retreat, but into something that served the people who never would have been allowed past its gates before. A tech and business center, offering workshops, mentorship, and startup incubators for underrepresented youth across Chicago. Angela didn't speak for a moment. Then she smiled. "You're not just moving on. You're rewriting the map." I began the application process immediately. The estate was rezoned for education use. I hired an architectural team to make modifications, convert the west wing into classrooms, the east into co-working space, and the top floor into temporary housing for visiting mentors. I kept one room for myself, not as a residence, but as an anchor, a quiet study overlooking the lake where I could work, read, and remind myself why I started this journey in the first place. I had no intention of erasing the past. I just refused to be defined by it. The public announcement came in mid-April. The press tried to turn it into a redemption story, calling me the heiress who turned her family's shame into social good. I ignored the headlines. What mattered were the applications that came in the first week. Over 200 students from the South Side alone expressed interest. Their ideas were sharp. Their letters were honest. Most of them began with the same phrase, "I never thought I'd be allowed into a place like this." That was the moment I knew we were building the right thing. Claire called me shortly after. She didn't ask for anything. She just said she heard about the transformation and wanted to visit. If that was allowed, I told her it was. She came the following Thursday, wearing flats instead of heels, and brought a box of old books she thought the students might like. She didn't mention Ethan. She didn't ask about Daniel. We walked the garden together in silence until she stopped near the greenhouse and said, "You're better than all of us, Rachel." I looked at her, steady and calm. "I'm just finally being myself. You all taught me how not to be." That night, I stayed in the study alone and reread the letter Aunt Vivian had written years ago. It was tucked between two property ledgers, addressed to me in her sweeping cursive. In it, she wrote, "They will never see you until they need you. Don't wait for them. Build anyway." I folded it gently and placed it in a glass frame on my desk, because that line wasn't advice, it was permission. The house had once been a symbol of legacy, tradition, and silence. Now it was full of sound of keyboards clicking, of laughter echoing through halls, of kids asking questions no one had ever taken the time to answer. And every time I walked past the old dining room, I remembered that night when Daniel said I had no place here. The irony was, by trying to push me out, he handed me the keys, not just to the house, but to the future it could hold. The first student walked through the front door of the estate on a Tuesday morning in early June. He was 17, tall, unsure of where to put his backpack, and visibly stunned by the space around him. He paused under the chandelier in the entrance hall, the same one my mother used to insist we dim for dinner, and whispered to himself, "This place looks like a movie." I watched from the side and said gently, "Not anymore. It's yours now." That was the moment I stopped thinking of the house as something that had to be defended and started seeing it for what it had become, a vessel for something entirely new. Over the following weeks, more students arrived. Some came from public schools and neighborhoods the city ignored. Others had dropped out and were returning to try again. We had classes in coding, financial literacy, product design, and public speaking. Volunteers showed up daily, some former tech executives, some artists, some just people who had been looking for a way to give without waiting for permission. I saw kids laughing in the courtyard where Daniel once berated junior staff. I saw teenagers writing pitch decks in the drawing room where Ethan had signed fraudulent contracts. It didn't feel like poetic justice. It felt like function finally replacing performance. One afternoon, Angela Ortiz and I sat in the sunroom reviewing applications for our fall fellowship. She looked over the edge of her glasses and said, "I hope you realize this is going to be national within a year." I didn't respond with a smile or a quip. I just nodded. That had always been the plan, not for praise or legacy, but for impact, the kind that sticks even when the headlines fade. When the first donor board went up in the main hallway, my name wasn't listed. Neither was Aunt Vivian's. I had it engraved simply as the people who weren't supposed to get in, because those are the people who usually build the most. In the background, the legal process continued. Daniel was indicted on 4 counts, including corporate fraud and document forgery. His bail was denied after prosecutors received the audio recordings and his signed confession. Julia cooperated with authorities and accepted a reduced sentence for her involvement, though she was barred from holding any financial leadership role for 10 years. Ethan settled civil charges quietly, returning most of the funds from his offshore accounts in exchange for avoiding criminal trial due to age and health. He moved to Arizona, where no one knew his name. Claire called occasionally, asking questions she never used to care about. Things like, what are the kids learning, or how are you keeping them engaged? She started sending boxes every few weeks, books, old photos. Once, even a set of lab microscopes she found at a school liquidation sale. She signed every note with just her first name. No expectations, no apologies, just a quiet presence in the background of something that no longer belonged to her, but was allowed to move on without bitterness. Nora became the operations manager of the center, running logistics with the same precision she once used to manage a household of lies. She created systems for scheduling, supplies, and student housing, but more than that, she became someone the students could talk to, someone they trusted. When one of the girls in the robotics class told her she wanted to be an engineer but didn't think she was smart enough, Nora said, "If you weren't, you wouldn't be here." Simple, firm, true, just like she had always been. I kept my office in the same study where I had first found Ethan's ledgers. The shelves were now filled with books about systems thinking, equity-centered design, and the ethics of innovation. I didn't sit behind the desk often. Mostly, I walked the halls, sat in classrooms, joined coding sessions. Every few weeks, someone would stop me in the hallway and ask what my role was. I always gave the same answer: I used to live here. They never asked more. It wasn't important. One evening, as the sun set behind the west wing, I stood in the front yard where the garden had just been replanted with native flowers. A group of students were setting up for their first public showcase drones, apps, product prototypes all created inside a house that had once tried to push people out. I took a deep breath and realized something simple. The house hadn't changed me. I had changed it. Not with revenge, but with intention. Not with power, but with clarity. By the end of that summer, the transformation was no longer just internal. The house no longer smelled like dust and formality. It smelled like soldered wires, dry erase markers, and sometimes freshly baked bread from a cooking skills elective we didn't originally plan for, but added because one student suggested it. The walls, once lined with oil paintings of solemn ancestors, now featured framed blueprints, design sketches, and student-made artwork that showed what it looked like to imagine something better. There were no press tours, no curated narratives. We didn't need to tell anyone what we were doing. The work spoke for itself. One morning in early September, I got a message from a woman named Gabrielle who said she worked at the same startup that fired me years ago. She'd been a junior designer when I left. Barely noticed. Always quiet in meetings. She wrote, "I found your name listed in a funding report linked to the Vivian Fund. I just wanted to say thank you. Watching you rebuild this gave me permission to leave. I read it 3 times, then deleted it without replying. Not because I didn't care, but because she didn't owe me anything. No one did." That's the thing about freedom. It doesn't need acknowledgement to be real. Later that week, the first cohort of students presented their final projects. One girl built a budgeting app designed for families with irregular income. Another group built a drone prototype that delivered first aid kits to hard-to-reach areas. A boy who once said he hated math taught a workshop to younger students about logical thinking in everyday decisions. I sat quietly in the back during all of it, letting them take the room. The most powerful moments are often the quiet ones. When someone who thought they didn't belong takes up space without apology. When no one asks them to shrink or explain. After the showcase ended, I walked into the old conference room that used to host family meetings. The long table was still there, but the chairs had been replaced with softer ones. The walls were bare except for one framed sentence printed in black serif font. Use your seat wisely, or make room for someone else. I hadn't designed that. One of the students had put it up last week without asking. I didn't take it down. I just added a small sticker below it with a single word, noted. The next day, I received a certified letter from a legal office in Boston. Julia had signed over her last remaining claim to McAdams Holdings, dissolving her name from all future affiliations. She included a note, handwritten, folded neatly behind the formal paperwork. It said, "I believed him because it was easier. You didn't. I regret that." There was no signature, just an old photograph of us from college, before the marriage, before the lies. We were sitting on the floor of a dorm hallway, barefoot, eating instant noodles, arguing about whether leadership meant sacrifice or vision. I remembered that version of her. I hoped she'd find her way back. That night, Claire called again. She had been attending community workshops at a local library and wanted to start tutoring in reading comprehension. She asked if we needed volunteers. I said we always did. She came in the following week, not as my mother, but as Claire, a woman in her 60s with no agenda, standing in front of 3 middle schoolers trying to explain the structure of a paragraph. I watched from the doorway for a minute before heading back upstairs. Some things don't need fixing. They just need a different room to begin again. The final audit of the company's finances came through at the end of the quarter. Nearly $17 million had been recovered, redistributed, and reallocated into employee pensions, small business grants, and nonprofit partnerships. The board voted unanimously to retain the new structure. I declined the offer to become permanent CEO. Instead, I recommended someone else, a woman who had worked for years in a lower department and had quietly fixed more than she was credited for. Her name wasn't famous, but her record was clean. I told them, let's build a company that doesn't need saviors, just systems that work. And just like that, the chapter that began with a chair being pulled out from under me ended with a new seat being built for someone else. I didn't need to sit at the head of the table. I just needed to know that next time. The table would be open to people who had never been invited before. On the first anniversary of the center's opening, we didn't throw a gala or send out press releases. We held a potluck. The students voted on it unanimously, saying they preferred something real instead of anything polished. So that Saturday afternoon, the front lawn was covered in picnic blankets, collapsible tables, folding chairs, and trays of homemade food labeled in Sharpie on index cards. I brought lemonade. Nora brought her famous roast chicken. Claire baked apple crumble that disappeared in 20 minutes. It wasn't extravagant, but it was honest, and maybe that was the point. Around 4 o'clock, one of the students stood on the garden steps and asked if I'd speak. I hesitated, not because I didn't have words, but because I knew they didn't need a speech from me. Still, I stepped forward. I looked out at kids who had once been told they weren't enough, volunteers who had quietly shown up week after week, and mentors who had left 6-figure careers to teach for nothing but gratitude. And I said simply, this house was once a place that judged who walked through its doors. Now it opens them. That's because of you, not me. So thank you for building something better. That night, after everyone had gone and the last plate had been washed, I returned to the study where it all began. The framed letter from Aunt Vivian still sat on the shelf, her handwriting now so familiar I could recite it without reading. I opened the drawer where I kept the earliest documents, Daniel's confession, the old financial audits, Ethan's original ledger, and paused. I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't feel pity either. What I felt was closure. They had taken from me, yes, but they had also taught me what not to become. And in some strange way, that might have been the most valuable lesson they could offer. Later that week, I visited the small coffee shop on Belmont Avenue where I used to meet a friend from my startup days. It hadn't changed much. Same uneven tiles, same barista with the silver nose ring. I sat in the corner seat by the window and opened my notebook. Not a laptop, not a tablet, just a blank page and a pen. I started sketching out ideas for Phase 2 of the center, expansion into Detroit, a digital version of the curriculum for rural schools, a mobile lab van for tech deserts in the South. I wrote quickly, not because of urgency, but because the vision was clear now. The work had outgrown the house, and that was a good thing. A few days later, I received a letter from the state's Department of Education. The center had been nominated for an Innovation in Equity Award. Based on outcomes in student retention and measurable impact, I didn't care much for plaques or ceremonies. But something about the phrasing of that letter made me pause. It said, "In recognition of lasting change through community-led transformation." There was a time when I might have read that as language designed to impress funders, but now I read it as validation, quiet, earned, and permanent. Before the end of the month, I took one last walk through the upper floor of the estate. The old master bedroom had been converted into a project room with large whiteboards and rows of monitors. The place where my mother once stored fur coats now held student lockers. The closet where my father once hid deeds and tax documents now housed STEM kits and soldering tools. Every corner of that space had been stripped of pretense and refilled with function. As I walked through, I didn't feel haunted. I felt proud. On my way out, I stopped at the threshold of the dining room, the same place where, 1 year earlier, Daniel had smirked across the table and said, "Time to move out." I remembered that moment not with bitterness, but with precision. He had believed in exclusion. He had measured strength by silence. He had seen legacy as something to inherit, not something to earn. And now, even in his absence, the room answered back. The walls echoed with a different kind of sound, now laughter, clicking keyboards, low conversations about ideas and code and next steps. And I realized something simple, something final. The best revenge had never been revenge at all. It was rebuilding, quietly, intentionally, on my terms. So when people ask what happened to the family estate, or where McAdams Holdings ended up, or what I did after they tried to erase me, I always say the same thing. I stayed, and I built something they never saw coming. And then I opened the door so others could do the same. Because sometimes the best response to being told you don't belong is not to argue. It's to take the deed, sign your own name, and fill the house with voices they never expected to hear. Now let me ask you, what would you do if the place that once pushed you out suddenly belonged to you?